I will be talking about a very controversial topic concerning the so-called fiscal impact of migration. And I will be talking mostly about how that is conceived of in research, politics, and the media. And I will also concentrate quite a bit on refugee reception, because that is considered the most costly form of migration in the European Union. What I will also do is that I will use empirical example, or use Sweden as an empirical case to bring my points home. And this builds on a research project and a book that I've been working on for many years. It's called A Modern Migration Theory. And as you hear from that name, I will be greatly helped here by modern monetary theory as a new macroeconomic framework to really get the story about the economics of migration right. And as you will see as I go through it, I will also need to talk about some basic macroeconomics and show why an alternative macroeconomics and a correct macroeconomics will be very helpful in the debate we have now around migration and refugee migration. So what the situation we're in today is that researchers and policymakers today, they agree that refugees and low-skilled migrants admitted to the EU, that they constitute a net cost and a fiscal burden for the welfare state, for the receiving societies. Researchers, they draw this conclusion from a seemingly neutral counting exercise. They simply say refugees, if we take that group, they contribute less in taxes than they receive in welfare assistance. Politicians, of course, are very eager and happy to use this economics to justify increasingly restrictive asylum policies. And that's what we see in Europe. So they claim that the welfare state simply cannot afford to absorb so many refugees. To be sure, politicians and researchers may judge low-earning and low-skilled labor migrants to be both useful and affordable, but only on the condition that their access to the welfare state is restricted. Researchers conceive of this as an inherent trade-off between migration and the welfare state. So yes, there is an option to have a lot of migrants, a lot of labor migrants, but then they cannot get access to the welfare state. Otherwise, if they are to get access to welfare state, they have to be low in numbers. Refugees will always then, from this perspective, since they don't work initially, be a bigger drain, as they say, on the welfare state. And that's why politicians are, as I said, very eager to use this argument when they close the door to asylum seekers. So I have a few examples here from research that illustrate this. This is from a journal called International Migration. Here the author argues that the refugees present a fiscal burden for the host countries, at least short and medium term. Thus, when the majority thinks that the refugee represent a fiscal burden, they take out more from the public purse than they pay in. They are not wrong this time. It is not possible to argue against this with solid empirical evidence. Naturally, the moral and legal obligation argument for accepting the refugees is still valid, but it couldn't be underpinned with further economic reasoning. The moral obligations and the economic benefit are in conflict here, end quote. So this is the perspective I will argue against them. I will say that, yes, we can find very solid empirical evidence to refute this thesis. But the quote also signals that you don't have to be against migration per se to use this argument. It's just saying that it's a cost. So the debate we have now is not whether it is correct from a macroeconomic standpoint to argue as such, but the only argument we have is that everybody agrees that it's a cost to admit low-skilled migrants and refugees and let them have access to the welfare state. That's the cost. The question then becomes, can we afford it? So it becomes an affordability question. And we know who's winning this debate. It's clearly those who say we cannot afford it. And I want to say it's not a question about affordability. Here's yet another quote from research saying the lower the skills and earnings of migrants in the host country, the greater will be the strictly economic case for restricting some of their welfare rights in order to minimize the fiscal costs for existing residents. I've underlined the strictly economic case just to signal that a lot of researchers, they use economics here as sort of a laws of gravity. They're simply claiming that there's no political choices involved here. We are just adapting to economic laws of gravity, and I will say that that is a flawed argument. Here is another, just one more example, again underlining this. If the expansion of immigration is concentrated among the low-skilled, the developed world's fiscal finances will deteriorate significantly. Again, this is a huge body of research that argues as such, and I just gave you 3 sort of small sample of that. If you illustrate this, we can do it like this. What they say then is that there is, if you don't make above average, if you don't pay in the above average tax payment, you will be a fiscal burden. And if you're a refugee or low skilled, the likelihood that you're a burden is very, very large. And so this is one way of illustrating how these researchers go about arguing their case. Again, I would say that this is, I will come back to it, but this is just a perfect illustration of how these researchers misunderstand society. And media, of course, they follow suit. This is just a few illustrations from the refugee crisis 2015 and onwards. A lot of headlines making these claims that how will European countries pay for the influx of thousands of people? Can the welfare state survive the refugee crisis? Here from The Economist, refugees tend to drain the public purse, and so on. So let's then go to test, so to speak, this thesis around the fiscal burden on Sweden. So let's use Sweden as a case. I've spent a lot of time researching what happened in Sweden after 2015. So given policymakers' certainty about the fiscal unsustainability of refugees and the scholarly assurances concerning refugees' negative fiscal impact, the Swedish situation in 2015 should then provide the sort of ultimate worst case scenario from a financial perspective. Because Sweden then, one of the most comprehensive welfare states in the EU, admitted 163,000 asylum seekers in 1 year. And Sweden had been proportionately the country in the EU who admitted the most, even many years prior to that too. And since the majority were given permanent residence, they were also incorporated into the welfare state. So from this research perspective then, all the conditions for a perfect storm were in place. But as I show, so were the conditions for a perfect natural experiment to test the literature's and policymakers' assertions about the fiscal burden argument and the trade-off argument. In Sweden in 2015, the finance minister was clearly on board with this argument, claiming that Sweden would be very much financially hurt by the increased spending that was necessary to accommodate so many refugees in 1 year. So she made this sort of case that we had to spend, but it was a necessary evil. So it's about cutting migration costs as well as looking into spending cuts in other areas, and we will also have to borrow money. So signaling to the public that this was really not going to be easy, and it might hurt other constituencies who would have to give up some of their welfare privileges and hand it over to the newcomers or refugees. So where do all these assertions come from? Well, they come knowingly or unknowingly. I would say that most people are. If we separate the economists who know where they get their assumptions from, most other researchers, policymakers, they're quite unaware. But it comes from neoclassical or orthodox economics and the sound finance premise that we have there. And that's the assumption that central governments, they need tax money in order to spend. So they first have to take in tax money before they can spend it out. If they don't have enough tax money, they have to borrow first and then spend. So there's a budget constraint, there's a solvency requirement. The government can go bankrupt, they can run out of money. There's a big sort of nervousness around that. And that's why we have austerity, and that's why we have all these fiscal rules. All these fiscal rules we have around spending limits, debt ceilings, and so on, they come from this perspective. So all the rules in the EU about the Stability and Growth Pact, the Eurozone rules, and in Sweden, the fiscal framework that Sweden has had since the 1990s. All of that is related to this perspective that comes from neoclassical economics. And it's built on this analogy with a household and the businesses, so that it's just modeling the central government as if it was spending approximately like the household, meaning it has to be very careful, it has to live within its means, and so on. So if we then take the mistaken way of looking at refugee spending, I've made this little picture here to illustrate what I mean. So this is, again, the mistaken view. So here's the household of Sweden, the little house. And prior to the refugees coming, we just say that the Swedish central government is spending 100 crowns a year. That's this budget. It taxes back 100, so there's a budget balance. But then you have to the other side, there are refugees coming into this household, making up a fiscal position of -10, so 10 crowns. Let's just make it very simple. It means that post-refugee reception, the budget now spends 110, and there's a deficit of 10. So what can the government do? Well, it can increase taxes, it can issue spending cuts, it can borrow, it can do all of that. The point is that there will be a redistribution from citizens to refugees. And that's, of course, where we get this debate about a trade-off, that it will hurt other constituencies because they will get less welfare or higher taxes or something like that, risky borrowing and so on. But again, this is the mistaken view. So let's then bring in modern monetary theory to get this straight, to get this correct picture instead, because what MMT can show then is that this orthodox view is flawed in many, many ways. And I will just give you a few examples here. One failure it suffers from is that it fails to distinguish between currency issuers and currency users. Central governments or countries that issue their own money, their own currencies, are not revenue constrained. They are the monopoly issuer of that currency. So they don't spend from taxes, and they don't borrow their own money in the way we think for financing purposes. And of course, they can never run out of money. COVID-19 has shown that very clearly in the sense that we have had this record amount of spending, and there's been absolutely no risks involved in this. And that has to do with the fact that these financial rules we have, they are politically motivated. They don't rely on economic rules. They're politically imposed and motivated. And once they are removed, we can see then that they are politically motivated. Because if they were economically motivated, then we would run out of money. But we don't. We can't. And there's a lot of other failures from this orthodox or neoclassical view. As I will show, one of the greatest mistakes is that there is no debate in this literature on the fiscal impact distinguishing between financial resources and real resources, meaning labor and so on. So I will illustrate that soon. So how does, from an MMT correct descriptive approach, how does the central government spend? A government that issues its own freely floating currency, that doesn't borrow excessively in another currency that is not pegging its currency and having a fixed exchange rate. So like Britain or like Sweden or the US or Japan, Poland, and so on, all these countries, the government spends simply by crediting bank accounts. And the spending cycle always begins there. It starts with spending. So the central bank credits the banking system with central bank reserves, and the banks, they credit our deposits with our banks. Once that is done, the spending is financed. How then does the central government tax? Well, it taxes by debiting bank accounts. So it's just the reverse. The central bank debits the banking system, our accounts at the banks, and the bank's reserve accounts at the central bank. They are just debited. But it's in that order. It starts with spending and then it taxes. If it didn't do it like that, there would be nothing to tax because the central government is the monopoly issuer. And the same goes for borrowing. So when the banks so-called borrow money to the state by buying debt, by buying securities or bonds, banks are paying with bank reserves, but those bank reserves can only be created by the central government, meaning the treasury, the finance department, and the central bank. So in order to lend money to the central government, the banks first have to get those bank reserves from the government. So it shows us that it's not a borrowing operation in the way we think about it. It's not like when households are borrowing at the bank. And again, this is just a description. This is how it works. And again, COVID-19 showed this in so many ways, and it has also altered the way many people now are approaching, and even some politicians, central bankers, and so on, who now understand. And this description is now out, and it's not a political sort of script here. It's just a description of how things really work. And it has gone so far as the ECB's president, Christine Lagarde, she said in the end of 2020, she came forth saying that, quote, as the sole issuer of euro-dominated central bank money, the euro system will always be able to generate additional liquidity as needed. So by definition, she said, it will neither go bankrupt nor run out of money. So there we go. This is MMT. This is just a description of how it works. And if we remember the Eurozone crisis, when Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and so on, were going almost bankrupt, meaning they ran out of money. We know now that it was political rules that prevented these countries to continue to spend and to force them into austerity. This time, what the ECB did and what the European Commission did was to say that from now on, when the COVID pandemic hit in March 2020, they simply said, you can go on and spend now. The ECB will buy up all the debt on the secondary market, and there will be no austerity strings attached. So the Eurozone has been able to spend pretty much in the same way as like, let's say, Britain, Poland, or Sweden. And this has really shown that this is not economic rules. This is not economic laws of gravity at work here. This is simply political constraints that have been imposed. Once we remove those political constraints, we see what the possibilities, what sort of, that there is so much more flexibility in the system. And Lagarde is not the only. The Swedish central bank, he said the same thing, said we don't run out of money here. We can spend our Swedish krona as much as we want and as much as it is needed. No one is saying that it should just be spent as much as possible. But so this is the way it is. The interesting thing, I mentioned COVID here, the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, that in Sweden, it had the same results as COVID in the sense that the government decided to suspend temporarily the fiscal framework that it had with a surplus target, with a pay-go rule, and so on. So in order to cope with the large spending increases that were needed, the government simply suspended that framework and could spend them freely. So a lot of funds were created, a lot of extra government spending took place in 2015, 16, 17, and a little bit in 18. And that was to make sure that the 163,000 asylum seekers were taken care of. When we go into the details and when we look at what happened in Sweden during this time, we can then illustrate it correctly. So before I showed the household model and said that this is the false picture, and now I present what really happens when the central government spends. And as you see here, this is what happened. We have the state, the central government. It needs to spend a lot of money on refugee reception and integration. It means it credits the accounts of those instances that will do this type of work. So most of all, the municipalities in Sweden, the local and regional governments, they received a lot of funds, but also the private sector, businesses and households, people needed to be employed to work in reception and integration, and a lot of goods and services needed to be purchased from the private sector. I added the box here, welfare, that goes with the municipalities, because welfare policy in Sweden is in practice implemented in the municipalities. They have a lot of financial responsibility, and so that's also where the money went to beef up welfare, really, in the municipalities, because there were lots more government funds coming out than were actually needed, and that was very helpful for the municipalities' economy. And as we saw in 2016, which should have been then the disaster year for Swedish municipalities, it was the complete opposite happened. Out of Sweden's 290 municipalities in 2016, 281 ran surpluses. And surpluses here are good because municipalities, they don't issue the currency, they are users of the currency. So they need to bring in money first and then spend. These surpluses enabled municipalities to invest a lot in welfare and a lot of other things that had been postponed due to previous austerity. And it showed, if you go down and to the local level, you will see clearly that there was no trade-off between refugee migration and welfare. On the contrary, the welfare spending, the refugee spending helped welfare spending. So in many municipalities, they could build new schools, new elderly care centers, and they could repair, they could invest, they could pay down debt, they got better liquidity and so on. And most of all, they got new people. They could fill vacancies and so on. So it was a very good sort of virtuous cycle for municipalities. What we also see here then is something that is neglected in the neoclassical from the neoclassical perspective, the fact that by definition spending equals income. So when you look at the fiscal impact literature and you listen to politicians, when they talk about spending on refugees and so on, it sounds like as if money is just disappearing. It's just a waste, it's a drain. But by accounting rules and logic, all spending equals income somewhere else. So when the central government spends on refugee reception and integration, the money shows up as net income in the non-central government sectors. Municipalities, businesses, households, and so on, they receive income. So instead of asking then how much refugee reception and integration, how much it costs, we should ask how much income it generated, where that income went, and what the income did. And as I show in my book, the income did a lot of good things for the welfare situation in Sweden. So here's the crucial distinction then to be made also, that is never done in the neoclassical approach, between financial resources and real resources, meaning real resources, that's labor in this. It's knowledge. It's all those things that are not that fall into in the financial realm. COVID-19 revealed finally gave some headlines to essential workers, and showing also that essential workers are disproportionately migrants and people with refugee background. They do more to keep societies working than the natives. And this is the lesson, and this is the lesson I bring up in my book, because Sweden is an extremely it's extremely good case to show this of real resource contribution from those with refugee background. So close to 30% nationally and about 55% in the Stockholm region of those working in the Swedish elderly care, they are foreign born, and basically all of them have refugee background. 60% of the cleaners in Sweden are foreign born. And the list goes on and on and on. There's so many important so much important work being done in Sweden by disproportionately by people with refugee background. And I think this should be enough to see why the prevailing view of refugees as fiscal burdens is really, as I said, misunderstanding society. Because fiscal burdens, it's per definition a bad thing from this perspective. And in the public debate, it's really, really driving an anti-immigration, anti-refugee sentiment. But the question we have to ask then is, would Sweden or any other country having this situation, would Sweden have been better off without these workers? Because that's what the perspective really says, better off without these fiscal burdens. And there's so many other figures to bring to bear on this. I mean, Sweden is unique. It's increasing its working age population only because of refugee migration. And this growth is picking up as I speak. In 2017, the labor market added 94,000 jobs. 75,000 or 80% of those went to foreign-born workers. So that's just one illustration. An even better illustration comes from Eurostat, the median age population development between 2008 and 18. Here you see the blue tops that indicates a rise in the median age over a 10-year period. And there's only one country in the EU where we see no increase in the median age, and that is Sweden. So this is a very good illustration. So in conclusion then, I would argue that given the enormous political salience of the fiscal impact of migration, that debate, it would make a huge difference if research could clarify that it is incorrect to conceive of government spending on refugees or low-skilled labor migrants whose tax contribution then fall below average. That it's wrong to perceive of this as a cost and a fiscal burden. It is to do that is to misunderstand society, because it is saying that we would be better off without the people working in elder care, all the assistant nurses in the hospitals, all the cleaners, all the people working in food production and so on, that we would have been better off had they not been here. Rather, as I show, refugees amount to a beneficial addition of real resources. The government spending, for its part, will do what government spending always does. It will end up as income in other sectors of the economy. That is, as income from municipalities, businesses, and others involved and employed in the management of refugee reception and integration. Those advocating human rights then should not have to concede the mistaken orthodox assumption that refugees are costly and then simply have to argue that we can afford it. It's not about affordability, and nor do they have to think of the economy as the enemy. Receiving refugees in the EU is not an economic or fiscal sacrifice. And finally, I think it's important that I emphasize too that I'm not saying that the EU should admit, or Sweden should admit, refugees because it benefits the EU. The EU should admit refugees to defend and uphold human rights. That's the reason. On the economics of it all, however, there is no argument. As I show, in admitting and investing in refugees, that is real resources, the EU cannot but benefit. So there is no real argument there. It cannot be in any other way. Thank you.